Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your indulgence, and I know it's a long day. You're doing great. We really appreciate it. Now we'll resume questioning, and Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses, and I just want to start off also by just apologizing to our witnesses, particularly Mr. Roth, for just the homophobic rant and comments that were recently just made from the gentle lady from Georgia. That was really shameful. And I know that we're here to talk about serious issues, and we're having conversations about Grindr and other issues, which is not really what this hearing is about. So I apologize to all of our witnesses. Want to note that I am someone that you would probably call a Twitter super user. I use the social platform constantly. I communicate regularly. It's how I get my news. It's how I find out what's happening in popular culture. And I admire what Jack Dorsey, Evan Williams, and Christopher Stone actually tried to build as a company. I wish I could say the same for what the platform is today. I think to me and to many other users, we've seen the site currently degraded. We've seen Mr. Musk more interested in attacking journalists and uplifting conspiracy theories and actually running a company. And I think we can all agree that just overall the service has substantially degraded. I think just an example is the forced For You page mess that I personally don't like, and I think most folks don't as well. But I want to know more seriously that Mr. Musk and the current team has also done damage as far as trust and safety on the platform. He's gutted the trust and safety teams that have been described. He's eliminated content management systems and the human rights team, which, as we know, has ceased to operate. I do want to just take a minute to thank Mr. Roth and particularly Ms. Navaroli and your teams. I know that you were trying your best. I want to thank all of the folks that worked at Twitter because they believed in its mission. A mission I'm not sure holds true today completely, but it's one that I know a lot of folks worked on. And so just thank you for that work. And mistakes were made, and clearly you have actually lived up to those mistakes and the issues that have existed. But I especially want to thank you for your work around the pandemic. The pandemic took over 1 million American lives, 1,300 in my own city back home. And your decisions in content moderation actually saved countless lives in this country, including the work you did by moderating or banning members even of this committee who peddled in lies and were actively causing death and harm to others. And so for that work on content moderation, I want to thank you. And I want to go back to something that Mr. Roth said briefly. You had mentioned earlier in this hearing that you thought that currently there's still systemic election interference and interference happening. How serious do you think the current threat from Russia and other countries is to current election interference?
I think we can look to the evidence from the midterms to know that these campaigns are ongoing and they are serious. And it's not just Russia, Iran, and China, though they are the big players. There's now a playbook for how election interference works. And it's unfortunately all too cheap and all too easy for countries to try to carry this out.
Thank you. And I think it's pretty clear what we've learned today. One thing we've learned, which hasn't been much, by the way, is that there's current election interference happening today by Russia and other actors. And so that is something that's serious. That's which the focus of this hearing should actually be about, versus all of this kind of nonsense and lies and conspiracy theories that this committee is actually focused on today. I want to take the remaining balance of my time and yield to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
I thank the gentleman from California. I'd like to raise and follow up on a point that the opposition and the other side of the aisle is making, which is trying to insinuate that there is something scandalous or unusual about federal agency outreach to social media platforms and other organizations such as Twitter. The insinuation here is that in the FBI and other agencies reaching out to Twitter, that there's something nefarious about this, that this was some sort of partisan weaponization or attempt to intimidate. But we actually have quite a documented history of representatives from the Trump administration hailing the progress that the government had made in working with companies like Twitter to counter foreign influence operations and other areas of concern. In early March 2020, right before the Super Tuesday primary election, several Trump administration officials, including Mike Pompeo, Bill Barr, Chad Wolf, and acting director of national intelligence, Richard Grenell, issued a statement praising the government's cooperation with the private sector to fend off foreign interference and said that relationship was, quote, stronger than it's ever been. This was around this whole time where there's this grievance around this. And listen to what DHS Secretary Chad Wolf had to say just weeks before the 2020 presidential election. We now have direct lines of communication with tech and social media companies and election officials so that both parties can seamlessly take action against false information spreading online. I would argue that this information from the Trump administration would say that they would support your decision in temporarily suspending this disinformation that seemed to be coming out from the New York Post. So with that, I yield back to the chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gaddy, Charlie Kirk and Dan Bongino are conservative commentators. Is that a fair characteristic? Just yes or no would be fine.
I believe so, but I'm not familiar with them.
Okay. The posters behind me show the side of Twitter that is not available to users. Is that correct?
This appears to be a view of some of our agent tooling, but I do not have access to that, so I'm not very familiar with that.
Okay. Well, Ms. Gaddy, the labels identify status that have been assigned to these accounts. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Ma'am, these are your internal things. You're telling me you don't receive these, you don't know what they mean?
Representative, I did not have access to these tools, and so I don't know. They look familiar to me.
As an executive, you did not have access to inside information at Twitter. Okay. Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Bongino's account, there's a few words under the verified and active. Can you read the first two labels under verified and active? They're the yellow ones.
Notification spikes, search blacklist.
All right, thank you. Ms. Bongino, ma'am, Mr. Bongino has more than 3.5 million Twitter followers. Is that correct, would you say?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that
Okay,
question.
well, that is correct. Let's look at Mr. Kirk's account. Ms. Gaddy, can I get you to read the yellow labels on Mr. Kirk's account? Can you see those?
I'm sorry, I can't see them from right here.
All right. Do you know that Mr. Kirk has almost 2 million followers?
I was not aware of that.
Okay. Let me ask you, what is a search blacklist?
I do not know specifically what that is, but I could make a guess if that would be helpful.
Why don't you make a guess for me, please?
We do, when I was at Twitter, there was an ability to prevent something from appearing in one of the tabs of search results.
Okay, thank you. What does do not amplify mean?
To the best of my recollection, when I was at Twitter, it would mean that we would not recommend or amplify that content in the parts of Twitter where Twitter was making recommendations.
Thank you, ma'am. In 2018, you said that Twitter does not shadow ban. Twitter did, however, engage in what is called visibility filtering. One Twitter employee described visibility filtering as a way for us to suppress what people see to different levels. Do you agree with that characterization?
I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question?
I said Twitter, okay, they engaged in what is called visibility filtering. One Twitter employee described visibility filtering as a way for us to suppress what people see to different levels. Do you agree with that characterization?
I agree that visibility filtering does give an ability to change.
Okay. Shadow banning, ma'am, is understood that the practice is limiting the visibility of a user's post without their knowledge. How is visibility filtering any different?
Representative, I believe there are different definitions of shadow banning.
Okay. But you said that Twitter in 2018 does not shadow ban. Was that a truthful statement, ma'am? Was that a lie?
At that time, I'd specifically defined shadow banning to mean something different than visibility filtering.
You also said that Twitter does not shadow ban based on political viewpoints or ideology. Do you stand by those comments?
While I was at Twitter, to the best of my knowledge, we did not do that.
Okay. Mr. Roth, on January 22nd, 2017, you tweeted that there were actual Nazis living in the White House. Do you still stand by that comment? Yes or no?
Sir, I regret the language I used. No, I do not.
Okay, Mr. Roth, earlier in your testimony, you said you regretted tweeting that, quote, actual Nazis are living in the White House. However, Iran's Ayatollah sent anti-Semitic tweets, one stating, quote, Israel is a malignant, cancerous tumor that has to be removed and eradicated. Yes or no, did Twitter ever ban the Ayatollah or remove this hateful anti-Semitic tweet? Yes or no?
To the best of my knowledge, Twitter did not remove that
The
tweet.
answer is no. Mr. Chairman, it's clear that conservative voices are being silenced on social media and in the mainstream. I appreciate this hearing. I might also suggest we look into holding one on DirecTV, Newsmax, and OAN. I give the rest of my time to Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his good questions. So the user knows when their account's been suspended or blocked, but they don't know when they have some of these gold terms that were under Mr. Bongino and Mr. Kirk. Is that right, Mr. Roth?
As of the time that I worked at Twitter, yes, that's correct.
So they don't know if they're on the search blacklist. They don't know if they're on the do not amplify. They don't know that.
That's correct. Twitter did not disclose
So
that.
you did that to these two accounts. What I want to know did you know, Mr. Roth, if that was at the prompting of anyone from the government?
Gentleman's time's expired, but please answer the question.
No, sir, I'm not aware of any requests or orders or demands or anything from the government requesting that visibility filtering be applied to those accounts or any others.
Chair recognizes Mr. Frost for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I mean, I've been sitting here for over 2 hours, and I'm still not really seeing the point of this hearing. Is it to solve the problems of the American people, what people are struggling with? No. We get it. My Republican colleagues wish that the Hunter Biden story would have helped them win the 2020 election, and that didn't happen. And so they're angry about it, and that's the point of this hearing. You know, it was actually the foundation of the chairman's opening statement. It's why he brought up that poll on the 2020 election. That's what this is all about. And so I want to say to my colleagues, don't worry. There's still many platforms you can spread disinformation on, Parler, Truth Social, that have questionable editorial policies but aren't here today. There was no collusion, as the witnesses have said, under oath. There was no pressuring from the United States government, as we heard under oath. We're wasting our time here bullying former Twitter employees. So that way, it's calling the ref. So that way, in the future, when they want disinformation to be put on the internet, social platforms will be scared to call them out down the road. It's called calling the ref. But let's talk about the root of this hearing. My Republican colleagues would have folks believe that Democrats are preparing for some sort of major culture war. And there's a difference between a culture war and how culture naturally changes, culture change. Some on this committee are very resistant to culture change. I mean, just yesterday we heard a member equate immigration negatively to changing our culture, black and brown folks coming to our country. The reality is that culture changes, it adopts, it welcomes more people, it becomes more understanding, and it also decides to reassess what's acceptable behavior and rhetoric. It could be different now than it was in, say, the 1950s. In this supposed culture war, they often conflate the right to free speech with the non-existent right to not be criticized or held accountable for what you say on the internet or even in real life. And just because it's legal to say something and the government won't throw you in jail for it, doesn't mean the rest of the world, and sometimes even your own family, have to associate themselves with you or your comments. Mr. Roth, you helped set up content moderation policy at Twitter. What type of user tweets were more likely to get limited? Did it have to do with racism, sexism, homophobia, violence, or were y'all looking for people who were supporting Donald Trump, President Trump, and limiting those?
Our policies were built fundamentally to be viewpoint neutral. They were focused on harm reduction, looking to things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with a focus on protecting people's safety, people's right to free and fair elections, people's rights to free speech. And we built concern with those rights into our policies.
That makes, so being a decent human being.
That's certainly what we tried to do,
Gotcha.
yes.
Ms. Naravoli, earlier you testified about a 2019 tweet that was about President Trump, and I think it was from Ms. Teigen. What was the tweet about?
Would you like me to give the direct quote?
Yeah.
Please excuse my language, this is a direct quote, but Chrissy Teigen referred to Donald Trump as a pussy-ass bitch.
Okay. Free speech. And what happened after Ms. Teigen posted her tweet? What did the White House do? What did the Trump White House do?
From my understanding, the White House reached out to ask that this tweet be removed. It was my team's job. This fell underneath the policy for abusive behaviors, and we evaluated underneath our insults policy. At that time, up to 3 insults were allowed, and so it was our job to determine how many insults were included within that phrase.
So the Trump White House reached out, not an agency, but the White House reached out and requested that you remove the tweet.
From my understanding, yes.
Okay. Mr. Roth, you mentioned a serious problem of foreign interference in our elections. Did you see that mass interference work more in support of right-wing candidates like President Trump in 2016 or President Biden in 2020?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one, and I don't think there's a clear or easy answer to this. We saw Russian operatives playing both sides and often playing them against each other. One of the most enraging interactions that my team saw were accounts operated out of the same Russian troll farm arguing with each other.
Got it.
And they were manufacturing drama both on Democratic sides and on the Republican
So it's still a huge issue.
Absolutely.
100%. Well, there you have it. There's issues of big tech. There are serious issues we need to litigate. Hunter Biden's laptop is not one of them. And like many of my colleagues have said, we need to talk about these issues, how January 6th maybe could have been prevented if Twitter had taken action due to the hateful speech, and how we have foreign interference in our elections. Why are folks on this committee so obsessed with Twitter's editorial decision on Hunter Biden's laptop? Would they hold the same hearings of the editorial decisions of Fox News and Newsmax? Free speech is about the government limiting speech around about the public. My governor, Ron DeSantis, is doing that right now. I have a venue in my district that he's revoking the liquor license of, trying to close because they had a drag show. We have teachers who are not able to teach the curriculum that they want because they disagree with Ron DeSantis and his view of the world. That is limiting free speech, and I'd love to see this committee bring in some of these governors who are abusing their power, like Governor DeSantis in my state of Florida, to limit the free speech of people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. And thank you for our witnesses for appearing as well. I want to be clear. Despite claims in witness testimonies, government cannot deputize the private sector for actions that would be otherwise be restricted by the Constitution. In this case, the censorship of lawful speech. Now I want to direct you to a tweet over my shoulder sent by President Trump on October 5th, 2020, before Twitter banned him from the platform. This was after President Trump had become infected with COVID and received treatment at Walter Reed Medical Center. It says in part, "Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life," end of quote. Do you see that, Mr. Roth?
Yes, sir, I do.
Less than an hour later, you received an email from James Baker at Twitter, reproduced behind me as well, saying, quote, "Why isn't this POTUS tweet a violation of our COVID-19 policy, especially the don't be afraid COVID statement," end of quote. Isn't that correct, Mr. Roth?
Yes, I believe that's the email displayed.
Now, Mr. Baker, was it your understanding that the Twitter COVID-19 policy was people should be afraid of COVID?
Sir, my recollection.
Yes or no?
Could you repeat the question, sir?
Was it your understanding that Twitter's COVID-19 policy was, quote, people should be afraid of COVID? Yeah.
At that point in time, I did not fully understand what Twitter's COVID misinformation policy was, and
Okay.
so I was trying to understand.
I'm recapturing my time. So maybe you thought that Twitter's policy was that it should dominate people's lives. Is that what you thought?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard
The other
time hearing
part.
you, sir.
So is it the fact that Twitter, don't let it dominate people's lives? Is that the problem with the tweet?
I didn't, at that point in time, I did not understand fully. I was relatively new at Twitter, and I was trying to understand what the policy was, and therefore I was.
I just want to ask you, the other two were asked, where did you go to medical school?
I beg your pardon?
Where did you go to medical school?
I did not go to medical
Very
school.
good. Now, I'd like to have a yes or no from each of the witnesses on these following questions. Did you or others at Twitter communicate with government officials by means of disappearing messaging systems like Signal, Snapchat, or Wicker? Mr. Baker, yes or no?
Have I ever communicated with a government official using those?
Yes or no?
I don't recall.
Ms. Gaddy?
Not to the best of my
Mr.
recollection.
Rao?
Yes.
Mr. Rowley?
Not to my recollection, no.
Once again, did you or others at Twitter receive requests from federal law enforcement to allow criminal activity or content whose distribution is criminal to proceed on Twitter? Mr. Baker?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question, sir.
Ms. Gaddy?
Can you please repeat the question, sir?
Mr. Roth?
If I understood the question correctly, it was whether we received requests to allow unlawful activity, and
Yes.
the answer is no.
Okay, Ms. Navaroli?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Now, I'd like to submit for the record an article by the New York Post titled, quote, "Twitter refused to remove child porn because it didn't violate policies." Ms. Gaddy, who was involved in this determination?
I'm not familiar with this situation.
Mr. Roth, are you familiar with it?
No, sir, I'm not.
Once again, I'd like a yes or no from each of the witnesses. Did you apply labels to users with an administrative tool to downrank them? Mr. Baker.
I'm sorry, sir. I'm having a very hard time hearing your questions.
Ms. Gaddy.
I'm having the same problem, sir. Can you please repeat the question?
Mr. Roth.
I'm not sure I understood the question, sir.
Well, I'm asking you, did anybody use an administrative tool to downrank users?
Yes, sir, that's a part of Twitter's content moderation capabilities.
Mr. Baker?
Well, I'll rely on Mr. Roth.
Okay, Ms. Gaddy?
Yes, we're very public about our recommendation system and
Thank
how
you.
they work.
Mr. Chairman, today's witnesses played a central, powerful, and disturbing role in limiting not only free speech, but even people's good faith inquiries and research regarding their own health. The internet is increasingly where my constituents go to engage in civic discourse. Our liberties as Americans will be diminished if we do not recognize our speech is increasingly virtual and right now subject to hostility and threatened through bans and deplatforming. The suggestions by witnesses that all of the removal of, quote, lawful but awful speech, quote, was done in favor of users is bunk. You could just as easily provide content filter options to allow lawful speech, letting users decide what lawful materials they do or don't want to engage with. But you didn't. You censored and manipulated millions of people. Do not allow people like this sitting in front of us today to be the arbiters of truth. I urge my colleagues to support my Section 230 reform, Stop the Censorship Act, which empowers users with the editorial contract. Our private businesses, you always have a contract with your customers. Allow them to pick. I yield back my time.